well, good morning, everyone. And thank you very much, Jesse, for inviting me to participate in today's webinar. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples, the Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples, whose historical relationship with this land continues today. And that's from the southern end of Vancouver Island. So today I'd like to give a brief overview of the work that we've completed on the development of BC's Fisheries and Aquaculture Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Action Plan. It's actually a process that we started less than a year ago, so we've been going quite fast to try and sort this all out. And I would like to draw your attention to the graphic image on the right of the screen. This was a commission by a Coast Salish artist, Doug LaFortune, and it was based on information provided by our advisory committee to have them put together an image to represent, the action plan. And a thing that really informed it, if you can have the next slide, was this Wordle. And during our first workshop, we had quite a large collection of scientific experts from all over North America, States, mainly in Canada. And we asked them this one simple question, and we got their comments live, and this sort of summarizes their thoughts on ocean acidification and hypoxia. And of course, the bigger words are when more and more people would say the same thing over and over again. So we sent it off to Doug, and that's what came with the image. That was kind of a neat thing. So if I could have the next slide, please, and I can tell you where it all began. Right, so this process actually started a few years ago, and back in the summer of 2019, the province of BC completed a preliminary strategic climate risk assessment, and they evaluated 15 risks, and they identified ocean acidification as a high priority in this assessment. And you'll see that it's probably the highest on the chart. And so they said it was an almost certainty that by 2015, ocean acidification would be here. But what they also said was that the consequences of how bad it would be was moderate. And that was really based on a real lack of information on what's going on. So if we could have the next slide. And, it doesn't take long to realize that it's not going to be here by 2015. Obviously, it's here right now. We've got evidence of climate change in the marine environment all over the place. And the associated impacts on marine fisheries and aquaculture are starting to occur, and we're just starting to see what's going on. And of course, the first place we saw it was in Washington State with difficulties in shellfish hatcheries. Heat waves, of course, have been going on for years, and so have hypoxia events. So we're seeing more and more hypoxia events, and how those hypoxia events influence other things like algal blooms. And of course, one of the things in the action plan was to focus on this sector, fisheries and aquaculture, as an initial run. But of course, we hope to build it out as we go along. And just to give you a sense of how bad it is, there is a paper out there by Smith and a group of other scientists. It was in Science in 2021 that looked at these major heat wave events. And basically, when a single major heat wave event occurs, the direct losses were estimated at $800 million, and basically 3.1 billion in indirect losses for multiple consecutive years. So that's just what people can measure. And of course, the losses are a lot greater when you consider things like the cultural significance of things in the ocean. So if we could have the next slide, please. So in response to the preliminary risk assessment, the province came up with CPAS Phase 1, which is Climate Preparedness and Adaptation Strategy. And they came up with a funding envelope to look at 4 pathways. And in the 4 pathways, there was 3 actions that were directed towards the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, one dealing with monitoring and forecasting, one dealing with water infrastructure as it relates to agriculture, but then of course, to do a risks and vulnerabilities assessment for fisheries and aquaculture. We took that and we sort of kind of built it out a bit, and we decided what we really needed was an action plan. So that's what we did. And you have to keep in mind that it was a fairly large funding envelope. I think it was about $6 million. About half of that came to this ministry, but there was ministries across government that were working on various aspects of climate change. So it's part of a much bigger initiative. And of course, phase 2 of CPAS will start this year, and it'll go on for the next few years. So if I could have the next slide, please. Speed up here a bit. I think I'm behind. So this is just a picture of the advisory committee that we put together. This was put together in the summer. And I think what I really want to highlight here is, there's basically 19 members on this committee who are full members who represent 15 organizations. And if you look at the highlighted ones, which are, unique because there's some duplicates, you'll see that there's 15 organizations that represent a very broad range of government, local government, provincial government, federal government, First Nations leadership, and we have industry there as well. So it was a really good group of people to work with. So if we have the next slide, please. So basically, you got the advisory committee, and what we did is we spent a lot of time trying to decide how we were going to do this, and we came up with 4 key things that we wanted to study. And it was the state of the science was the first one, harvesters and producers perspectives was the second one, coastal communities perspectives was the third, and then we wanted to talk to policy and governance people here in the province. And that will then all be distilled down into what becomes our action plan. So if I can have the next slide, please. Here are the numbers. This is a tally of all the people who attended all the workshops. The numbers are pretty good, given the fact that we were going at lightning speed, and people weren't given a lot of notice. We had good participation for the science workshop, fairly decent and good attendance at the harvester and producer workshop. Coastal communities wasn't as well attended, and part of the problem there was because of the flooding events that occurred in BC in around October, November, which had a huge impact. We got pushed back over a month, and so things got compressed towards coming into February and March. But that's, if we had 2 years, we could have given people a lot more time. And I would say that definitely when you're planning these things, you want to have lots of time. So I have the next slide, please. So I'll just go, I can't really go over what we talked about in each of the workshops, but what we did is we did have someone, credit goes to Savannah Young, who basically sat in on the workshops and tried to create an image that summarized what everyone talked about over the 2 days or the 1 days that were there. So for state of the science, what we did is we gave an overview of the science and looked at the gaps. And then we spent some time talking about all the observing assets and work that's going on. We talked about modeling, biological impacts, and we started to touch on mitigation and adaptation. And you can see there's various things that came out of that. If I can go to the next slide. So when we moved into the harvesters and producers perspectives, we were kind of building on the first workshop, and then we tried to smooth it out or polish it in the next workshop. So we reviewed what happened in the workshop. We heard from commercial fishers, we heard from First Nations, traditional and commercial fishers, seaweed farmers and harvesters. We heard from the UN Global Compact, salmon farmers, shellfish farmers, but we spent more time hearing what their kind of industry was, what it was about, what the issues were, but talking a lot about mitigation and adaptation offshore and nearshore, and then adaptation strategies for shellfish and things like adaptation for commercial fishers. And the big message that came out was they would like to balance food security, economy, and cultural significance in producing seafood, but also the need for science to inform the sector to develop adaptation strategies moving forward. So if I can have the next slide, almost there. So then we met with communities. The communities workshop was more about talking about hearing from various folks to find out what their concerns and needs were, talking about adaptation and mitigation solutions. And one of the things that we did have, which was really quite special, was Sarah Cooley from the Ocean Conservancy gave a great presentation to open up the workshop. And she talked about what decision maker, how they approach problems. And what thing that I remember really, really well was decision makers ask themselves 3 questions. How does ocean acidification rate to my portfolio? How bad is it? How bad will it get? And what can I do? But she also said, when you talk to various folks like constituents, resource managers, or businesses, they all have a different sort of way of looking at risks and perspectives. Constituents might be worried about mostly about food security, or as resource managers about environmental sustainability, and businesses, might worry more about business continuity. So everyone has a different lens that they look at, and that's what's really important to try and fold into the plan. So if I can have the next slide, please. I think this is my last slide. So when we started off with our first workshop, we came up with a straw dog of what our goals and objectives would be. And basically and then the next workshop, we then revised them. And the next workshop, we revised them and expand them and revised them, expand them to the point where now I think we have to kind of rein it all in. But we have 5 goals, and you can see those across the top. And each of those goals has an objective. So 2 objectives for, building and strengthening OH science collaboration and engagement. The most, of course, come from advancing science and understanding of OAH, and each of those objectives has actions. And right now, and time doesn't permit, if you add it all up, we have 63 actions that would fall under all those objectives. Concurrently, while we were doing that, we also submitted an application to the UN Ocean Decade to have our action plan recognized as a project under the OARS program. So that hopefully we'll find out about that in June. And then sometime in June, we actually hope to have the plan drafted and completed for presentation to government by July. And my apologies, I went a couple minutes over.
Not at all. I am so grateful for that presentation, Myron. And truly, I mean, I am just totally impressed with yourself and the steering committee that's taken on this effort. And I love sharing this example, and really grateful for you sharing the example today, even though it's not, of course, still in the process, because I think it's one of the few examples I've seen where you have the climate risk assessment that is then informing the need for an OAH action plan whose goal is to develop and inform research priorities that are then going to feed back ultimately into the larger climate resilience strategy for the province. And I just think that that is such a great way to think about how this process, what do these types of processes inform ideally? So really grateful for your partnership. So glad to have BC as a founding partner of the Alliance, and we'll obviously continue to share out how the process is going in BC. So thank you for that.
I would like to say this is totally not a singular effort. And I do have to put a major shout out to Wiley Evans, for those who know him. If Wiley hadn't been around, this never would have happened. It's as simple as that. And also, all the other folks that were on the advisory committee, it was truly a collaborative effort. I was just the guy who got the money, basically.
Well, we all need people that go get the money. So thank you for being that person. And thank you also echo Wiley and other leadership as well on the line here today.